I'm Brandon Isle with BYU-Idaho Radio, and joining me on the phone is Richard Robison. He's the founder of Robison Institute and the author of the Teton Letters, which you can find on Substack. Richard, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Brandon. Good to be here.
So this project that you've undertaken is pretty cool. You've kind of dived into these oral histories of the Teton Dam Flood that were taken, I guess, 49 years ago. This year is the 50th year, and they did it about a year after the actual flood. Can you tell me what kind of got you started on this project?
Well, I've kind of been a student of the Teton Dam disaster since the disaster occurred. Everyone that was there at the time has their own unique experience and perspective, but I was the oldest nephew of Robert Robison, who was in charge of the whole Teton Dam project. So growing up as a kid, my dad and I would go up and visit my uncle at the dam, and he'd show us what was going on and explain different things during the stages of construction. And then, the disaster happened, and later on I went into engineering, and so I've always been curious and a student, and, when I had the chance, I'd talk to my uncle about things over the years. He didn't like to talk too much about it. But so I've really been a student of the Teton Dam disaster for 40 years and understand the engineering aspects about it. And years ago, out of curiosity for different reasons, I went in and looked at some of the oral histories, and I was really interested in seeing what the people who were interviewed a year later had to say about rebuilding the Teton Dam, because people don't realize now, 50 years later, that after it broke, they actually wanted to go right back to work rebuilding it. And there was a lot of people who wanted that done and a push for it, and of course it never happened. But all the people in these oral histories were asked in their interview whether they would support rebuilding the dam, and I was curious about that. So that's what kind of got me into the oral histories years ago. And then as a result of that, all these people, historians study these oral histories and write about them. But, I realized I knew all these people growing up. They were my bishop, stake president, mayor, friends of my dad and my uncle and different people. And I thought, people aren't going to go read these oral histories, and each one of them, a good story could be written from it, more in like Reader's Digest form, where, the average person could just sit down and enjoy a nice story and learn about the Teton Dam disaster and get an actual human story from, different people's perspective. So that's kind of what got me started on all this. That was a long answer.
No, it's so interesting because as you read these, the first question is, one of the first questions that these historians asked was, did you support the dam? And I don't think I've read one where they said no. And then one of the last questions is, do you think it should be rebuilt? And most of them say yes.
It was just astounding to me that I discovered that. And that was my first curiosity, because non-disclosure, I am an advocate of rebuilding the Teton Dam for a lot of reasons. The reasons they built it in the first place are even worse than they are today. Right now we know that the entire state of Idaho is under a water emergency. It's the first time in the history of Idaho water. And, there's curtailments again. So all the reasons they built it in the first place still exist, even more so today. And, going through the oral histories, there's just a handful of people who didn't support it from the beginning. And most of them are the same people who in their interview said they wouldn't support it again.
Right.
So, but people who had just totally been wiped out, a lot of them could have died. It's a miracle that, the 11 deaths were tragic, but, one of the miracles from the disaster is how many people didn't die that could have. And so these are people that knew they almost could have died, and were wiped out, went through a year of literal hell trying to clean up and rebuild, and 1 year later asked if they would rebuild. The majority answered yes.
Yeah. Well, and there's a push now that you talk about on your Substack to get it built now, 50 years later.
Yeah, there's a push now, and one of the legislators there in Idaho that's leading this push is Senator Kevin Cook in Idaho Falls. And I was put in contact with him about a year ago by the commissioner of the Idaho Potato Commission, Darren Bitter, and I've been kind of working behind the scenes as a technical advisor to Senator Cook for about the last year on the rebuild efforts.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you kind of followed in your uncle's footsteps to be an engineer, and you've been studying this for over 40 years, you said. Is part of this, I think you kind of point out several times that this was not your uncle's fault. The engineering was sound.
One of my goals is, over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of armchair quarterbacking that, naturally happens. That's what we do as humans. And, when you have the, hindsight's 2020. So, it's easy to second guess things. And, but the independent panel that studied the cause of failure determined, without question, that my uncle and his team that built the dam were not to blame, that the blame was entirely in the way the dam was designed and the fault of the Denver Design Office. And they could have specifically put things into the design that for some reason they chose not to. And that traceability has literally been lost from the Bureau of Reclamation. And had different design decisions been made, the dam would probably still be standing today. So, one of my objectives in these stories is not only to tell the human story, but also to set the record straight 50 years later, some of the technical information around what the, actual cause was and what really happened.
Well, it's so interesting, the hindsight of this is, like you said, 2020, but really as the 50 years have gone by, the people who remember it today, who lived through it, they may remember it differently than what it was right when it happened.
As I've written a few of these stories, as I write them, I always check to see who's still around. And, so many of the people have passed on now, including my father and my uncle. But, a lot of these people have passed on. Today I just published Nola Vance's story. Her and her husband Neil have both passed on. But I always see if they're still around and try and get a hold of them to see how they remember it now 50 years later or 49 years later compared to their interview that was done, summer of 77. And yeah, their memories kind of do fade. And so, yeah, that's true.
As you're writing these stories, it's interesting, the ones that you've brought to the forefront. You've obviously talked about Don Ellis, who was the KXRK radio announcer, the owner of the radio station, who really saved a lot of people. He was out there at the dam site and told them to get out, to evacuate. And you have people in Roberts who were also flooded, and just these different stories. 1,500 Brides, where you talk about Arthur C. Porter's business of wedding invitations. Just so many cool things that you've brought out. How do you decide which stories that you're focusing on?
I've got so many of them, and I'm trying to put 2 of them out there a week. And, it's really week to week. I've only been putting them out there. I've had a lot of these stories written for months. And, originally I didn't really know how I was going to publish them because, I really have no publishing background. I'm an engineer and I've done a lot of technical writing, but anything technical I've written in the past has all been proprietary to the companies I worked at and consulted for. So, this is a first for me. And, finally, as it was getting closer to this June 5th, I thought, well, I got to start getting these stories out there. And I want them to all be in the same place. And, I want it left as a legacy where, if people want to go look into the oral histories themselves, they're all there. But, I wanted them written in story form all in one place. So I decided to, do it on Substack and have a publication called the Teton Letters. I feel like when I write these stories and I read their oral histories and then decide how to write them, I was actually there and, like I say, knew these people and knew what they went through at the time. And so as I write these stories, I can write them in such a way where, the flood and what happened is not an abstraction to me that I've read about or seen pictures of. I was actually there with these people. And so that might kind of be my personal touch on some of these stories.
Yeah. How old were you when it happened?
I was 2 months shy of 14.
Just right in the prime, right?
Right in the prime. And, one of the stories I plan on doing here soon, I don't know if it'll be a Teton letter or some other kind of bonus story that I just put on Facebook. But, the oral histories were obviously mostly adults. There's actually a few of them that were children, like 7 or 8. But there's not really any teenage stories. And so, going from, I would say, the class of 76 to the class of 81, we were the teenagers. And in pop culture, it's always the teenagers that run the town, right? Especially a small town of Rexburg. And so what was that, what was it like for us? And yeah, so my perspective was, that of a teenager. We all had summer jobs back then. Regardless of our situation, most of us had to go to work that Monday moving pipe. A lot of the teenage boys back then in Rexburg moved irrigation hand lines on, worked for different farmers. And, that's how we made enough money to buy our own Levi 501s or, the cool clothes back then.
Well, it's so interesting because all those farms that you probably worked on were higher up, so untouched by the floodwaters, right?
There was so much farmland that was, damaged initially, and it took years. Some of the farmland around Wilford's, been in the process of being reclaimed still 50 years later. But the miracle was, a lot of the farmland was high up enough where, the majority of it was still being farmed that year, so life and farming still went on, a lot of it on the bench, a lot of it, in the Moody area that wasn't impacted by the flood. So yeah, we all had to get up and move pipe the next Monday, the teenage boys.
Yeah. So take me back to that Saturday, June 5th. What do you remember? How did you first learn about these waters coming to Rexburg?
About 10 in the morning, the dam broke at noon, right before noon, 11:57, and it had been kind of leaking pretty bad since really around 10 when it started leaking bad. And I remember that Saturday morning, like every Saturday morning, we were kneeling in the living room floor having family prayer. And it was my parents' wedding anniversary. And the phone rang, and my dad answered it. And, I can't remember now who exactly it was. It might have been my aunt. And, he was told the dam broke. And then my dad was trying to get a hold of my uncle up at the dam, to find out what was going on. So we found out what was going on kind of early. And, so we turned on the radio too. By then, my uncle had called in the early warnings to Madison and Fremont County sheriffs. And that's what, Don Ellis heard, my uncle made that call, and then the sheriff called Don Ellis to tell him about it since he ran the radio station. And, he had to see it for himself to believe it. So like I wrote in my story, he grabbed his daughter and drove up to the dam and was actually up there with a two-way radio patched back into, the KRXK studio back in Rexburg, kind of calling the play-by-play as the dam actually broke there. So we spent the rest of the morning, just my dad finding out from my uncle anything he could. But of course, my uncle was busy up there, obviously. And so we had the radio on, like everyone else. And then once, they announced it actually broke, I remember getting up on the roof of our house and sitting up there, from the roof of our house up on 350L Avenue. We had probably the best view you could have, the floodwaters coming in, that you could have in Rexburg. So
yeah, wow.
It was, people in all these oral histories, people describe the wall of water coming in, but from Rexburg up high, watching it come in, it didn't look. You really saw what looked like a big brown line or a big brown cloud of dust, because from the pressure wave in front of the wall of water, it had a dust cloud that formed in front of it, kind of pushing everything along. So I just remember sitting on the roof of the house, and I'm not going to say my memory's perfect, but if I recall, President Eyring's son Henry Jr. was up on the roof with us, and a couple other neighbor friends, and we sat there and watched the wall of water come in, carrying houses and barns and anything else in its path with it.
Yeah. As I've looked at photographs of that day and the days after, I mean, it's just horrifying to think that you would have to experience this after the flood. And I see the pictures, but I can't smell the smells or have the feeling itself, right?
Right. Yeah. It's it's like, you can look at the pictures and read the stories and, but I can see it clear as day in my mind. And, so someone who actually didn't see it, I don't know if they actually get the right image or not. I suppose they do, but it's just, it's one of those things that, as one of the county commissioners, Dale Klingler, who immediately became in charge of the civil defense operation, in his oral history, he explains it as the people who had all escaped to the hill sat there and, watched the flood come in. They weren't screaming or crying. They were in awe because they knew they were seeing something that no one in the world would ever see. Like something from a movie.
Yeah.
So the people were all just, just weird because, that people knew they were safe and they could see their homes being destroyed. But again, they were marveling at just the spectacle of what was going on.
Right. Well, and it's such an interesting contrast. They did go to the hill, but many of them, like I know some of my wife's relatives, they put like the flour on top of the table, or they moved their papers upstairs or something like that from the basement, and they didn't think the floodwaters were going to really affect them that much, but they did.
Yeah, people really didn't think that they were going to get that much water and it was going to do that much damage. So, they acted like, they were preparing for a foot of water or something.
Yeah. Well, I read the story of the Roberts mayor and the calculations that he tried to do is like 25 feet of water. We're going to get at least 3.5 feet here in Roberts.
And it turns out he was only a foot off. So, he was a pretty good hydrologist. But the mayor of Roberts story, I remember as a kid knowing that, because I could look out from, off our balcony over the valley looking towards the butte. We called it the R Mountain then. Then, Roberts is off to the south west of that. So, you could see the lake out there even the next day. So we all knew, that Roberts had been hit. But I didn't realize that Roberts had kind of been forgotten about, and was just kind of, for the first 2 or 3 days, the national media's attention was all on Rexburg, that had Ricks College, and of course Wilford, that had been wiped off the face of the earth, and Sugar City, that had almost been wiped off the face of the earth, and all the attention was there. These people out in Roberts are just kind of out there on their own for a few days. Eventually they got help. But, the water didn't even reach Roberts until very early Sunday morning, about 4 a.m. And the people there believed it wouldn't reach them because they had a railroad embankment that had blocked floods in the past. So most of them didn't even believe they would get flooded.
Yeah.
But sure enough, the water came over the railroad tracks, and they literally sat under submerged, their town submerged in water for weeks. Because, the water came through Rexburg and moved on. But when it came to Roberts, it just stayed there and formed a big lake for weeks. Yeah. They had to pump the water out.
Yeah. So many stories. And I love how you're able to make them come alive and make them so personable. You mentioned you're a technical writer. You did technical writing. How are you switching from technical writing skills to really make these stories come alive?
I don't know. I'm just doing it.
Just do it one story at a time.
Yeah, I took creative writing classes in high school and stuff, and so I've done, or in college, so I've done creative writing and journaling and stuff like that. But as far as publishing, I've never published anything that's creative writing, but I've published plenty of technical things over the years. So yeah, this is a new experience, and doing the best I can. Hopefully people are enjoying the stories that find them and read them, and hopefully I put them somewhere. Maybe eventually they'll end up somewhere else, but like I say, I want to have them all in one place and all out there for people to enjoy.
Yeah. And are you going to put these into a book as well?
I'm doing children's stories from some of them too. I don't know if you've seen any of those.
Yeah. Yes.
Because I thought, and I've tested some of them out on my grandkids. I call my granddaughter Jean my quality control.
There you go.
for the children's stories and my two grandsons. But I'm thinking, it'd be cool if parents, could read Teton Dam stories to their young children. Kind of storybooks, and them not to be frightening and and traumatized. Toned down for a child to read, and still a good story, and maybe even learn a lesson from them. So maybe down the road, I picture maybe a anthology of children's Teton Dam stories, maybe 15, 20 of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, the normal adult version of the stories. Yeah, I could see them being put in a book or something someday. I just haven't really figured out the best way to do that, or
you're still writing
how to make that happen. This is honestly, this is going to take me. I look at how many of them there are, and I didn't plan on doing all of them at first, but I've decided, why not? I know how to do it, and it's fun, and people are enjoying them, the ones seeing them so far, and so I plan on just taking at least a year to get all these stories out there. I'm trying to do 2 a week.
Right. Well,
in fact, this coming Tuesday is going to be President Eyring's story. So
we look forward to that one.
That's kind of a special one to me, since we lived 3 houses up from him growing up during the Teton Dam disaster.
Yeah. So you're not just writing these stories from the oral histories. You're also creating some music from this. This is so fun. The music odyssey, you're calling it.
So I grew up with a little bit of a music background, even though I'm not a musician. Yeah, but I understand music theory and what makes a good song. My father was a aspiring opera singer that ended up being convinced to come build a music program at Rick's College in 1961. So, my dad taught me growing up that there's no better way. That the thing about music is it's the only thing that directly communicates to a person's soul. So, as I got writing some of these stories, I thought, that's a song. so I started working with Trent Walker, who's a Grammy-nominated music producer with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. So we decided to turn a few of these into songs, starting with actually his mom's own oral history that is written but not published yet. And so now we've written and produced a few songs, and I consider it a way where if you listen to a course of 10, 15 songs, you could actually experience the Teton Dam disaster in a musical odyssey, and not only read, but actually feel and experience what it was like through music from, different people's points of view. So that's what we've been working on. I've been embedding some of the songs in these stories that people can listen to. Eventually, we're trying to figure out how they can get airtime, and we envision actually a 17-song album. Wow. that Trent's actually cut. Now it's just a matter of getting them out there in the right way, and so people can listen to them and experience the Teton Dam disaster through music.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly play them on KBYI right here in Rexburg, so they've got a place.
Is that right?
Yeah.
They fit your format?
Well, whether they do or not, we can play them. How's that? I've listened to the first one, and it's country, and sometimes we play a little country, right?
From what I understand, and I'll have to see it to believe it with my own eyes if I can figure out how to be in Rexburg the week of June 5th, but there's an event that kind of culminates the week called Celebration of Service that's scheduled at the BYU-Idaho Center. And from what I understand, the Teton Dam song we produced called Waist Deep in June is currently being choreographed as kind of a dance number. So we'll see what actually happens. I hope that actually happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, the BYU-Idaho radio and the city of Rexburg are certainly free to use and enjoy these songs any way they'd like to.
Yeah, that'll be great. I see you've released 5 of them so far. Is that right?
Yeah, embedded in the stories.
Yeah. Actually,
there's a couple of others. One of the Teton Letters I published was just introducing the concept of a musical odyssey through the Teton Dam disaster. And I put 5 of them in there. And by the way, my personal favorite is Not Even a Sparrow.
Yeah.
And some of the individual stories I published also have a song embedded in them.
Yeah. A good opportunity to read them all so you can hear all the music too.
Yeah. And again, I'd love to get some feedback, but I like I say, I understand enough about music, and obviously Trent Walker does too. That I've tried to capture, kind of the feel capture the feel of this individual's story and what their experience was like.
Yeah,
and hopefully I've accomplished that.
Well, let me ask you this question, maybe to wrap it all up. But as people read your stories and listen to this music, what do you hope stays with them?
Number one, just to really get an appreciation for the variety of human experiences that people had. 50 years later, from really what was our country, a nation's most bizarre and surreal and largest man-made national disaster in history. And, I'd really like this to get national attention, especially, since it's the country's 250th year birthday. And, that summer in Rexburg, we were getting ready to celebrate the bicentennial. But, I hope people really are able to appreciate just the nature of this whole experience and disaster in a way where they don't have to go out and, again, read the oral histories that, read like an interview, and they're interesting to read, but, hopefully in story form. It's a quick read, where people can really see what understand what these people's experiences were like. And then really, I hope to honor all the people that were there. And, kind of like a family history. When I put out Mayor Laird, his story, the mayor of Roberts, I got a message from a woman who ends up as his granddaughter. Just out of the blue, I got a message saying,
wow.
"Thank you so much for publishing my grandfather's story." So I consider this a family history project too.
Yeah. Well, and I should have asked you what kind of feedback you are getting, and that's interesting to hear from relatives of these people who gave the oral histories.
If you saw the story about Jay Calderwood, which is one of the most cinematic adventure stories of the series. Jay Calderwood was a heavy machinery operator who was the excavation foreman that built the Teton Dam. And right there at the very end, he and one other man named Owen Daly were on top of the dam on big D9 Caterpillar bulldozers, pushing big boulders down into the whirlpool on the reservoir side of the dam, hoping that these boulders would kind of choke and plug up the hole. And, obviously the effort was in vain, but these guys risked their lives doing that. And when I published Jay Calderwood's story, I actually got a hold of his son, Clint Calderwood, who lives in Victor, and he went over and read his dad's story to him. Jay's still alive and doing well. And, sat there with his son and grandson and read Jay's story to him and played him his song. And evidently it was an emotional experience. So, hopefully some of these stories can touch people too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Richard Robison, thank you for joining me. You're the founder of Robison Institute and the author of the Teton Letters, which you can find on Substack. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. It was a pleasure.